All right, as we allow people to kind of join in here, we've just hit the broadcast button. So give everybody a second to kind of start in. But as we do that, I want to say good afternoon and welcome to today's ATI member exclusive training and education facilitated by GovMates on the topic of the process to relationship ratio. We're going to dive into like the really good business building model in just a moment, but I did want to get started with some of our reminders here. I am your event host. I am Meg O'Hara. I'm GovMates Director of Engagement, and I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout today's discussion. But before we jump into that, I'm going to provide you with a few participation reminders, just in case this is the first time that you're joining us on a GovMates facilitated webinar. The first one is to remove distractions. So we're going to, like I said, keep this to about an hour. We've got, a good amount of content here, and then we'll have time for that Q&A. So make sure you close down any unnecessary browser windows, silence your phone if you can. This is a great excuse to stay out of your email. Sorry, I'm on a webinar, can't answer right now. And then if you have a chance to grab some lunch, also a great plan. Other thing is to be active in the chat. Along the bottom, you should see both a chat box as well as a Q&A. If you'll use that Q&A to actually ask questions there, I'll make sure that they pop up so that I can take a look at them throughout the event here. But we do encourage you to be active. So if you see that chat button and you can give it like a little test run, if it gives you the option to choose everyone, you can do that. Otherwise, only I will see responses. But you can go ahead and let me know either where you're joining us from. We're getting into the nicer time of the year. So if you've taken like an early vacation and you're on like resort somewhere on this webinar, I give you props. And I'm also very jealous. But if you could just let me know that you hear me, that would be great as well. And then, as I said, we'll be taking audience questions. So if something is relevant to the group at large, we'll be sure to touch on it. But if your question is a little bit more nuanced and better for a larger discussion offline, we'll be happy to provide a way for you to connect with Troy for a more in-depth discussion after the presentation. And finally, we will be recording today's discussion. It should say recording in the top corner there, and can make slides available on request afterwards. So we'll make sure to send this out once the recording has finished processing. So this is where I get to introduce today's presenter, Troy Small, Vice President of Sales at Skyway Acquisition. Most recently, I had the pleasure of listening to Troy on a panel at the Maximize conference in San Antonio, which was fantastic. You shared some really great M&A advice over and tidbits over there, so I know that they were super appreciated. But Troy, I'm going to throw it over to you. Thank you for being here today. And can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Meg. It's so great to see you again. Yes, we had a wonderful time in San Antonio at the Maximize conference, and a lot of good information. And I may say you did a great job. So fantastic job as always. I'm Troy Small, everyone. Good morning to you, or good afternoon where you may be. I'm here in Southern California. I'm the Vice President of Sales for Skyway Acquisition. And Skyway Acquisition is a consulting and training company. Basically, we are a team of 11 former contracting officers, and what we do is we utilize the depth and breadth of our experience to help government contractors to be successful in government contracting. A little bit about myself is I'm a retired United States Marine. I served 20 years as an active duty Marine, two-time combat veteran. During my tour of duty as a Marine, I served 15 years as a contingency contracting officer. And that's where I originally gained my experience as a contracting officer in government acquisition, contracting, procurement, purchasing, whatever term you want to use. I gained all of that early on as a young man in my Marine Corps career. And since then, I've served in several roles in my 28 years of service in the military, post-military, working for the Navy. But I've been a contracting officer, purchasing agent, contracting specialist, the chief of contracting for Regional Contracting Center Fallujah, and also the assistant program manager for contracting for PEOC4I, for working for the Navy. And so I'm happy to be here today. I'm looking forward to jumping into our presentation.
So what you're telling me is that when I have questions, you have answers.
Yes, I should. If I don't, we got a problem. I should at least be able to go and find the answer at the very least.
We like that. We like that a lot. So from here, this is just a little bit of our agenda. Troy, I'm going to let you go over this. I'm going to throw the reins over to you so we can get our discussion started, and I will pass that your way. So thank you so much for being here.
Sure thing. Thank you, Meg. So just briefly for the agenda, and I'll go through this quick because sometimes I tend to steal my own thunder covering the agenda. But we're going to discuss the Pareto principle. We're going to talk about the 80-20 rule in government contracting, which is also known as the process to relationship ratio, which is the title of this class. We're going to talk about how the process relationship ratio compares and interacts with the three deciders. And you may say, well, who are the three deciders? Well, we'll cover that when we get to that slide. And then, of course, we'll end up with any lingering questions. Feel free, you can ask questions in the middle of the presentation as well. So I should be able to get myself back on track, even if we kind of stop there. So next slide, please. All right, so we're going to jump right in. So this is a picture of Vilfredo Pareto. And Pareto is an Italian economist and sociologist. This is the gentleman that developed the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule is known as Pareto's law. And what it says is, it states that 80% of the output is the result of 20% of input. So I'm going to say that one more time. So 80% of output in any given thing is the result of 20% of input. So let's examine that a little bit more closely, right? While you're thinking about that, let's kind of talk about some examples. Next slide. So some examples, of the 80-20 rule according to Pareto. So stating it in two different ways, 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. Another way to say it is 80% of your results, which is the output, comes from 20% of your activities, which is the input. So those on the call, I want you to think, let's think of your revenue, how much you make within your company. And if you're not the company owner or you don't know the revenue, think about how much you make in your own home. Is it true? As you think about it and reflect on it, does 80% of your revenue come from 20% of your clients? Another way you can think of it is, does 80% of your revenue come from 20% of your product or service, right? You may have a variation of products and services. If you take an objective step back and look at that, will it show that 80% of the money is coming from somewhere, right? Which is kind of a big deal, right? Because this is data. And what I've been finding as I get older a little bit and more experience in diving into information is that, the data holds true. I mean, it tends to hold true. This is how we can come up with principles and laws, because the information has held true over time. Now, one thing that we want to keep in mind is that this is a general rule, right? So it's not necessarily a hard and fast law. Let's talk about wealth. Think about the wealth in our country. Is 80% of the distribution of wealth, right? Does that belong to 20% of the population? And I think that might be true. Even with problem childs, right? I'm a former Marine drill instructor, and I do youth mentoring and involved in other things throughout life. But particularly as a drill instructor, what I find is that, this law has a variance as well, right? So let me take a step back. It's 80-20, but, in my research, it can go, from 70-30 to 90-10, right? As a drill instructor training recruits, we always had the 90-10 variation. We always used to say, you always have your 10%, right? You have your 10% that's going to muck it up, right? Right. And it holds so true, because as a drill instructor, I spent 90% of my time on 10% of my recruits. And those 10% were the best of my recruits and the worst of my recruits. And you may say, well, why'd you spend, a lot of time on the best? Well, because I had to give them instruction, because they were helping to run the platoon. They were like squad leaders and guides and things like that. And so you have to spend time to give them instruction on what you want. And right. So therefore they go out and help you, to achieve the mission. But the poor recruits, or the recruits that are not as disciplined, you spend extra time on those recruits because you have to bring them up to speed. They don't have as much discipline starting off, so you have to give them more discipline. But this is an example of how this rule kind of holds true in different areas of life. And so, and we're going with the 80-20 version. But my question would be, if you knew that this held true, would you operate a little differently in business and how you go about your efforts? If you knew that 80% of your effort is not as good as 20% of your effort, right? And you can look at that in different ways. You could say it in different ways, but that's kind of what we're looking at here today.
That makes sense. I think you can actually translate that to your teams. As you were saying in business, if you are leading a team, if you were taking it on the same vein as the platoon and who you're working with, you're going to spend a good amount of time on your leaders that are on your team that are making your business better, and they're actually going out and training their sales teams, and they're training the people who are underneath them. And then you're also going to spend a little bit of that time, hopefully out of the HR office, but probably handling some of those problem children who don't have the same drive as maybe another portion of that team there. So like you said, this can kind of be translated to several different options.
Absolutely. And as you said that, Meg, I immediately started thinking back when I was a manager, leader, supervisor, whatever term we want to use, but you immediately start thinking about those folks that worked for you or worked under you who were like dynamite superstars. You're like, yeah, I spent a lot of time on that person. And then there's others like who didn't quite meet the standard. Like, man, that I spent a lot of time there too. So for the folks on the call, in the sense that, this is really good of looking at your staff, to Meg's point, and maybe putting some processes in place to help you in either case. Next slide.
We like a good process.
Yeah, exactly. So the key in today's training is to understand that there are mandatory processes involved in government contracting. So let's kind of bring it to the playing field that we play in, which is GovCon. So non-government sales can be 80% relationship and just 20% process. And you compare that to a government sale, a business to government sale, that can be 80% process and only 20% relationship. So let's have an example here. And I don't know, this is a webinar, so I don't think the folks can necessarily respond to me, but maybe you can throw it in the chat or not. If you've, those who've purchased a car before, just, put a C. And if you've purchased a home, put an H in the chat. And if you've done both, put a C and an H. And this is just for participation, really. But
I've done both.
Absolutely, right. And I've done both as well. And so I'll use the buying a home example as the non-government sale, right? So we're talking about when you're buying a home, a lot of that can be relationship. You develop a relationship with your realtor. You can fall in love with her or him based on how cordial they are, how informative they are, how skilled they are, what they do. They're showing you all the perfect properties. You also could love a particular house, but not like a particular room and go and look somewhere else. You have the opportunity to change how the relationship is going. However, at some point, no matter how nice the realtor is or how great the property is that you're buying, there is a point in time where you will have to go through that process of signing paperwork for your new home or apartment if you're renting, putting down a down payment or initial deposit. That process piece is still going to be there, except there's a lot more other flowy, fluffy stuff that's there that doesn't necessarily have to do with the process, right? Also with buying a car, right? That car salesman, you guys can have a great time spending 1 or 2 hours walking around the lot, enjoying each other's conversation. But in the end, the car salesman's thinking, I got to get him inside at the desk so I can get this process going so I can close the deal. Now, compare that to government as an example. it's quite different. It's to the contrary, where in a government sale, it's not as much about the relationship. The government sale is more about the process. And the reason why is because there are so many rules and regulations in play that the government must abide by. I also say that, even when in government contracting, a lot of the relationship is a result of the process, right? You have to engage with each other to bid and respond and negotiate and all of that. So by nature of the process in government contracting, you have to have a relationship with your vendors and vice versa. But let's break this down and look at subcontractors and prime contractors. So in this government example, subcontracting opportunities are more so based on relationships. And the reason why is because as a sub, you're going out and you're trying to network and find a prime that will take you under their wing, and you all can benefit from each other. They benefit from you for what you bring on as a sub. And obviously you benefit from the prime because, number one, you're getting work. Number two, you're learning the process, you're getting your name out there, and all of those other positive things that come into place. However, at some point, even through all of that elbow rubbing and, hey, hook up, yeah, let's work together, I love it, let's do it, you still going to come to a point where you may have to sign a teaming agreement, right? There still may come to a point where there may be government flow down clauses that the clauses go to the prime, and the prime has to flow those clauses down to the subcontractor. Now the relationship doesn't matter. You're all about process. It doesn't matter how great a relationship you have to perform to this particular standard of the clauses based on the process. And so that's an example in the subcontractor. Now let's talk about a prime contractor, which is different, because a prime contractor is the entity that has the relationship with the government. The government does not have any privy to subcontractors. They only have privy to the prime because the prime is who they have a contract with. This prime government relationship is primarily based on process. It is in accordance with how the contracting terms and conditions are laid out, what you submitted in your proposal and how the statement of work goes, right? All of those documents, right? You have the statement of work, you have, you might have seadrils, you may have whatever is in Schedule A. All of these documents are regulating rigidity in the situation, if that's a word, and making you go through this process. And the only reason you have a relationship is because you have to call them if you don't understand, or you have to validate that you did it. That's the relationship piece.
There's not a lot of room for emotion there.
We're
not going out to happy hours as often when we get there.
No, we're not at all. And it's funny because I was chatting with Kevin about this, our president, and what the way I say it is that in the government contracting, the process is more in your face. Like, you cannot get around it. It's just there, right? It's something that has to be dealt with. Like, it's not something that you can kind of skirt around. Well, if you do kind of, try to avoid it without really being attentive or I'm missing the word that I'm looking for, but if you're not paying attention to that process, you're going to miss something, right? Yeah. If you're depending on the relationships that you might have, you're probably going to miss something, because the process is going to trump the relationship. No matter what your customer may say, the contracting officer, the business decider, is the one that's going to determine how things play out in this given GovCon process.
And that could cost you work. And that's the biggest, we talk about this all the time when we give presentations about, the fact that once you win in GovCon, that's great, but you have to keep winning. So just because you won one doesn't mean that they're automatically going to, sign you on for the next one. You have to continue to follow process alongside your relationship.
Exactly. No, you make a great point. And one of the things I noted was that when your contract ends, many times that's your relationship then ends. Like, that's it. And whereas in non-government sales or like if you enter an agreement with another commercial vendor, you have that project, it may end, but you stay in touch and you frequently reach back out to try to do more work together, right? You try to build on that. Whereas in government contracting, the government is not, they may like you, but there's a regulation, there's a process how they have to get to you. And oh, by the way, everyone else can jump in on that process as well. So once again, in my mind, since we're using the terms 80-20, I'm thinking, master 80% of the process. Like as a government contractor, as a small business or commercial vendor, however you want to term yourself, your strength is knowing what's happening in the process. If you can predict what's going to happen next, then you can prepare. And obviously those who prepare or they do better than those who don't prepare. So if the government is not prepared and you probably have a higher chance or a higher likelihood of getting the success that you want, or whatever it is you're trying to achieve at that given time. It's one of the things I noted is we have some very good contracting officers and contracting professionals out there. I mean, you got some awesome ones out there. You also have a younger contracting and acquisition force out there that are not as experienced and not as long in the tooth when we're talking about expertise and knowledge and mental flexibility on how to get things done in contracting. They just don't have that depth. And if you do, or if you find a way to bring that depth onto your team, then you will have a greater chance of being successful because you will be in a position to change the government's mind. Right. When faced with better information, you change your mind. And that's what the government will do. Right.
And I think part of that is the fact that we often go through in business, if you don't know something, like, I'll figure it out, whatever, it works. There is so much regulation and so much process that exists in this space that ignorance is not bliss. And so just saying, oh, I didn't know will cost you your contract. It will cost you, there will be fines, there will be consequences that pass down because you can't just claim ignorance here.
Exactly. Knowledge is power for sure in this space. Next slide, please. All right. So the purpose of this slide is kind of to reiterate, kind of look at the chart and view the correlation between, process-based decisions versus relationship-based decisions. And ideally, what you want to do, those are in attendance, is figure out where are you and your company on the graph here? Like, where is your pin? Because depending on where your pin is, then you'll be able to see, oh, I'm involved in a high process, high relationship, or high process, low relationship type of project here. And so you can adjust your approach. You can adjust your planning accordingly. Like if you were going to try to do a lot of door knocking and rely a lot of, maybe you hire someone who said they have relationships and you wanted to lean on that, you may consider otherwise, right? If you understand where you are on this particular graph. So let's take example, the bottom left quadrant, commodity or an impulse buy. This is a low process, low relationship buy. So it is akin to us pulling up to the gas station, right? I pump my gas. There's a process. I pull up, I put my card in, I select my, whatever number, I put it in the tank, take it out, put it in, or I go inside and pay and do the same thing, right? That is the low process of buying a commodity, in this case, gas. Same thing if you go to the grocery store. Oh my goodness, we need bread, milk, and eggs. On the way home from work, right? Meg runs into the grocery store. She grabs her eggs, she grabs her milk, she grabs a candy, well, maybe not a candy bar. She grabs a protein bar, right? And goes to the register, right? So here's the process. You put it on the table. The person scans it, the price goes in, they hit a button or two, she pays, she goes out, the process is done. The relationship is, hey, Meg, maybe she knows the person and she sees them weekly or biweekly, or maybe not. But that would be the extent of the relationship in that particular purchase, in a commodity or impulse buy, as an example. The bottom right quadrant is a little different, right? So when we're talking business to business or business to consumer, so if my company is selling to your company or vice versa, or if I'm selling services to consumers, well, a lot of this needs to be based on relationship.
Right.
And the reason why is because in the commercial space, we have a little bit more leeway. The commercial space does not have as many rules and regulations as it relates to how you enter into a contract, right? The government's trying to be as fair as possible. Commercially, you're just trying to get what you want from who you want at the least price, most efficiently as possible without breaking any rules, right? You're still not breaking any rules. So
it's almost risk mitigation versus like best deal.
Right. Exactly. So you're considering all the things that could negatively happen, and then you want to avoid those, right? So here's I'm gonna give an example. This is something that just happened 2 days ago, actually. So I brought on a new client with Skyway, and so this client was more relationship than process, because the individual, she found us through our podcast and she loved the podcast. She used the podcast to her benefit. And then she realized, man, well, if that was good, I wonder what the paid stuff is like, right? So she came, she talked to Kevin, and then we had a call. We had a really great call. It felt like we were old pals. Like, it just was a really nice call. It was just really comfortable. And she made her decision pretty much on the call that she was going to join. Right. But to the end, no matter how nice the call was, I can't just bring her on or take her card. At some point, I had to bring her to the Skyway process, right, of onboarding.
Right. But it started with that relationship that started however many, weeks, months prior.
Exactly. It started with that relationship, how many weeks or months prior. Now, I'm glad you said that, Meg, because that's an emphasis on how to, use relationship to your benefit in B2B or B2C, but it's not the same in government contracting. And I think this is where, I guess a foot stomp is required. And if you weren't paying attention, like, now is a good time, in the sense that government sales is low process. Oh, excuse me, low relationship, high process. You will always go through a significant amount of process in government contracting, even if it's even a micro purchase has a process, right? You have to, pay with the credit card and do all of that. And so that's something that you want to consider, where, I don't know, Meg, if you want to throw out an example of a government type of sale, whether it be high process, low relationship, or high process, high relationship.
I think a lot of the time what we're seeing, especially because, like you said, it's a little bit lower relationship, because you can't just pick up the phone and like call the CO for the project. And there's so much, I hate to use the phrase red tape, but there's a lot of tape, whatever color it may be. There is a lot of tape that exists in order to make sure that contracting officers are making the least risk, least high risk decisions in order to get the job done. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is that, though you need to have the relationship piece as you're getting new government contracts, that piece almost comes in more after you've won the contract versus putting your proposal in. Your proposal has to be very much, they tell you what the font you're supposed to use on a lot of them, and your margins. And like, there's a lot of regulation in just the paperwork itself. How many pages does your white paper need to be? All of these things are part of the process, which takes out the relationship piece so that they're not making emotional decisions. So they can go back to that at some point when, they're in the middle of the contract and say, no, this is why we chose this. These are the very clear reasons that showcased past performance, and they showcased the ability, and they showcased, the technology necessary. All of those things are highly processed in order to keep people from making mistakes. Because as humans, we can be very easily swayed when it comes to our relationships. Of course, I want to pick my best friend to do something. Of course, I want to pick, somebody I used to work with to work with me, but that kind of clouds the decision making, which is why all of this process does exist.
Yeah. You dropped so many nice jewels in there. I don't know where to start. So I mean, the process allows for fairness, and which is why you have a lot of it, is because the government is concerned with being fair. But think about this. Once again, if you can master the process for yourself and your company, and your competitors do not, that is a competitive advantage that you have, because you know more about what may or may not happen than they do, and you plan accordingly. So that's a competitive advantage in our space, because that knowledge is what is a separator. That knowledge of that, what I just stated, or what we've been talking about, may be the difference between what you put in your proposal response or what you don't, compared to your competitor.
Right.
The other thing is talking about the relationship. So Meg did a great job in the sense of speaking about how there's a lot of process there, why it's many times it's low relationship, high process. But let's talk about the upper right quadrant. Government sales that have a lot of process and considerably a lot of relationship considering. How does that happen? Well, Meg hit on it. I want to kind of expound. When you win a contract, that's the time to build out the relationship, because now you are kind of like an insider. You're almost one of them or one of us. I don't even know how to say. I just feel like I'm government, even though I'm not with the government. I feel like I'm still government. But
we'll let it slide that way. You can call it one of us.
Thank you. But like when you're industry and when you don't have a contract, you're an outsider. When you have a contract, you are now an insider, and you are kind of sort of one of the government people, because you can walk around the hallways, rub elbows, talk, and pretty much have conversations in that are not sensitive, obviously, but you're in the building, whereas other folks are not. So that is the time to build your relationship. You may say, well, how do I do that without doing anything wrong? Well, obviously, bang up outstanding service, being responsive. Even if you can't do it, just be responsive and saying, I can't do it. Like, just don't leave them hanging. Like, the more responsive you are, as a govie, I was always like, I can depend on this contract, because no matter what, they're going to get me an answer. Like, I just need information, whether it's right or wrong. I need something to go back and tell my people. And so many times the government is just looking for data to do their job. And if you can help provide bits and pieces of information that you may think is insignificant, but it's significant to them, you're actually building a strong relationship with that government client.
Yeah, it's never safe to ghost in GovCon.
Not at all. Not at all.
No. And one of the things that I also typically tend to hear is that when we get into that space, especially in the R&D space, which a lot of the people on the line are, it's getting the individuals, like the end users, in the room with the technical people. So you've created you've put your proposal in, and we've taken out some of that like high technical jargon, because your contracting officer doesn't always know all of the pieces that go into this specific technology necessary to get the job done. They want to make sure that the boxes are checked. After you have won that contract, get into the room with, like, ask for that meeting, ask to talk to the end users and say, like, hey, can we sit down here and like just take a look at what the art of possible is and what they're requesting? How can we do or not do that? And if it's actually something else that you want, that's a huge change, but then can be highly beneficial. So we did a podcast with a company that did get in on, an OTA opportunity, and they got in and they sat down and they said, hey, here's the technology that we have that you asked us for, but what is it that you actually want it to do? Like, we know you want this technology and that you have a roundabout idea, but what is the thing that would help you most? And the thing that the final product they ended up creating was so different from what they originally thought that they wanted. And not because anyone was wrong, but because they didn't know the technical ability of that piece of technology or that service or whatever that was. They didn't know until they got into the room what that looked like. And so that's a big piece of the relationship, because then they can go back and say, hey, we've worked with these guys before, and they were really good at helping us get down to the nuts and bolts of what we really needed versus what we thought was possible. And that's I think that's a big relationship piece that will then hopefully lead to more work down the line.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue. If you can go to the next slide.
Sure.
So that's a perfect setup for, okay, so how do we effectively use this information about the process to relationship ratio in GovCon, right? How do you use the PR in GovCon? Well, I'm going to cover it right now. So before I tell you exactly how, the first thing I need to get you to understand is who in the GovCon zoo? Like, who are the people that you're actually dealing with? Like, there's this big old, like, you submit your proposal, like, where's it go? Like, who are the people that are doing stuff?
Right. You're not just shouting into an empty room. Like, you're actually sending it somewhere. It's going somewhere.
It's going somewhere. Trust me. Well, what's happening is, we've broken this down into a concept called the three deciders. And in government contracting, you have three deciders that are pulling the strings, if you will, behind any given procurement or acquisition. You have your economic decider, which is the entity that has the money, whether it be the program office or what have you. That's the money piece. You have your customer, that's your client as a company. That's who you're really trying to sell to, because that's the unit, the person, the entity that really wants what you're selling. And then you have the contracting officer. The contracting officer is the business decider. This is the individual that's actually controlling the business process of putting out a request for quotation, receiving those proposals, assigning it to a source selection evaluation board, and on and on and on through that evaluation process, coming up with an evaluation decision, and then making the contract award. The contracting officer does that part. So
the contracting officer has some really very powerful mouse clicks to be happening.
Exactly.
It used to be pens, now it's mouse clicks.
Right. So one thing I want to point out is that in these three deciders, the economic decider, you most likely will never interface with this person or entity. They are there, but you most likely won't interface with them or affect them directly. But it's important to know that this is a part of the process that has control, because this is where the money's coming from. This is the customer's boss in a lot of cases. They control the customer's money, right? So, which leads us to our customer. This is the person who you've been talking to. And so, Meg, if you can click one more time.
Sure.
Right. So now you see here, your customer, this is where you focus on the relationship. This is after contract award, like Meg and I just discussed, or even more importantly, before contract award, because you're probably already talking to this individual. They're the ones that found out you have this G-Wang biz thing and you want it. They want it. You want them to buy it. And so they love you and you love them because they love you. And that's how it happens. And then you guys look at each other and say, okay, what do we do next? And everybody's like, I don't know. This is where now like there's a process. So now well, what we do next is we start the contracting process. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need to get your customer to ask the contracting officer, which is the business decider. And if you could click one more time, this is the entity that's focused on the process, the contracting officer. So if you're in pre-award, let's give an example here to kind of, help bring this home. There's a contract action that's going to be coming out in 90 days, or it's already out. The bid is not due for 90 days. You got plenty of time to plan. You got plenty of time to do all of your pre-award capture planning stuff. And you're like, who do we start talking to try to shape this and get our name in the building per se, or in the government's mindset to try to award? Is it the contracting officer, or is it the customer, or is it the economic decider? Not the economic decider, because once again, you probably won't even deal with them. It's going to be the customer, because the contracting officer is focused on the process, they are so scared of getting in trouble through an improper relationship that they push you to the process. They don't want to talk to you. They just don't want to talk to you. And it's so crazy because there's means that they can, be available to talk to you, but they steer away from it, or they don't have the experience to navigate the pitfalls that may come with that. And so you want to be focusing on your client in this case.
Right.
Meg, you want to add something there?
No, you're good. I was agreeing.
Yeah. I mean, so to bring all of this home in a sense is that when you start talking about the process and relationship, you understand that your customer, this is your champion. Your client, the one who wants your product or service, this is the individual, or this is the organization that's going to help you to have as much influence as possible in the process. How? Well, you are going to teach your customer how to buy. You're going to tell your customer what to tell the contracting officer. This is how it works. Well, this is how we teach it, at least. Right. And so why you say, how does that happen? Well, because the customer and the contracting officer, they're both gubbies. They're quote unquote friends. They're not afraid to talk to each other. So if you can influence your champion, your customer, and tell them, hey, my understanding of the process is this. I think you need to submit something to the contracting office and put me down as the recommended source of supply. As an example, you started it off right there. So now your customer goes down with a purchase request, say, hey, I want to buy this G-Wang thing, and it's Meg O'Hara Incorporated. That's the company I want to buy it from, right? And the contractor's also like, okay, they just start the process. They don't have any emotion about it. They just say, okay, and they just start their process. And so I'll leave it there. I think the last thing I'll say is leverage your client or your customer, once again, because they have the relationship with the contracting officer. So you can influence your customer to try to shape or target what it is that you want. But this is how you get through this process. It is mostly process in government contracting. And I've just explained how to use a little bit of relationship before and after award to your benefit.
So the things I'm hearing as takeaways, and if anybody has questions, make sure that you kind of throw them in as we're wrapping things up. But some of the takeaways that I'm hearing is that you can't throw out either process or relationship, even though it's GovCon. You 100% need them both. And I think sometimes we err on one side or the other, especially as we're getting into business and we're building business. We're like, oh, I'm in my relationship era, I'm in my process era. You have to have kind of a balance between the two and make sure that you're hitting on both of those in order to allow that growth to continue to happen. Because if you just completely forget one of them, as we said earlier, if you forget process, it's going to bite you. If you forget relationship, you're not going to be remembered. And I feel like one of the hardest things is to not be remembered. When you've done all of that work and then you go to see somebody and like, oh, I don't remember working with, like, that's a huge problem. Don't do that.
Exactly.
And
Can I say on what you just said real quick?
Please.
Thing you said, and remember, she said balance. So balance doesn't mean 50-50.
Correct.
Balance can be 80-20, right?
It could be 90-10,
right?
Yeah.
So just remember that. So I just wanted to say that part.
No, I think that's great. And then when we get down to this 3 deciders piece, especially when we talk the OT opportunity, just because you're in one space doesn't mean different vehicles can't be used by different customers. And so just because you have the relationship with one doesn't mean that they can't go. One of the biggest things is trying to get all of the different customers to talk to each other. We would love if there was that really nice communication between all of the different customers. It doesn't always exist, but if you can get one customer over here that you've got a great relationship to talk to somebody else who's also going to need your solution, that's another way to kind of get around there into, and then getting to your contracting officer from there. Sometimes we get siloed into our one thing. We're like, oh, I can only work with this customer. Well, Navy might need it. Well, Air Force might need it. Well, Army might need it. Like all of these different customers are going to need what you're doing. They just might need it in a different way. So opening the opportunity for that conversation in the relationship, who you have, that relationship you have with your customer, with your champion that you were talking about, that can also extend to other customers, not just the contracting officers.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. And I mean, it just shows how this is at it may be at scale, right? So we kind of talked about it at the lowest scales, like you interacting with a customer, but Meg just kind of described it and showed that, yeah, but a customer could be an office, right? Or it could be, the Marine Corps
Right.
compared
All right.
to the Army, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's scale. That's pretty big. And there are folks out there that go from small contracts to big scaled contracts, from one major organization to the next. So that's an excellent point.
And it's really getting in there and making sure that that process is sound so that you can like plug and play as needed. Because if you learn that process for one and can repeat it somewhere else with small nuance changes, that's a really nice way to kind of get in and move things around.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no magic bullet here. There's no magic key, but if we can make things a little bit easier and use the process to our advantage, highly recommended.
Yeah. And I think this is more a tool than anything. It's a tool to help for maybe for reflection or inflection. Like, maybe you're going through the process and you're running into a wall. And right. You're like, well, this is not something's not moving. Why is this not moving? I don't know what's going on. Then at that moment, maybe you take a step back and analyze, well, am I pouring all of my effort into the process, or am I pouring all of my efforts into relationships? Like, am I frustrated because the relationships that I thought were going to work are not working? And if that's the case, then, well, maybe I should not have been there in the first place. I should have been looking at the process, right? And so that kind of helps you to see maybe where you might want to switch your energies, if you will.
If you were to, Troy, I'm going to ask you this question. If you were to choose one thing on either side, right? One process thing, one relationship thing that you would recommend our audience does today to kind of get started. Say they're like right in the thick of things. They've won some, but they're still trying to get that momentum going. What is the one relationship thing that you would recommend that they kind of start with?
The relationship thing that I would start with would be, I would make sure that I have an understanding of who is truly managing or behind or running your contract. Like, for instance, you have a contracting officer's representative that's managing the contract for the contracting officer. And so that core, for all intents and purposes, would be that person. But I'm here to tell you, but many times that's just a representative of the true client.
Okay.
You want to find out who that true client is, because that is where you may find future work, because that's where you can learn, oh, I didn't know you had that problem too. Because the core just doesn't know. He just managing the contract. He or she's just managing the contract. So I would say find out who the true customer is and flesh out if, number one, what you're providing is working and what more they may have.
Perfect. And then one not so fun fact is that when you call somebody, they're not just going to give you the email address or phone number to whoever that person is. You might have to do a little digging. And from our experience, I'm actually going to say that LinkedIn is a really interesting place to find out some of this information, because people are super excited to talk about themselves. So just spending a little time on your LinkedIn feed and connecting with some of those people in and around the space will eventually help you hopefully get to some of those people that you're looking for. They're not all, I'm not saying that your contracting officers are typically on, LinkedIn, but at least you can find relationships with people who have worked with them before that may be a little bit easier to, get you into that door.
I would agree. We primarily use LinkedIn as far as networking and prospecting, if you will, and all of that, and looking for mutual clients. So.
Yeah, exactly. And then on that same question for the process side, tell me again, what is that one thing that you would, recommend? That is it learning the processes? Is it developing the processes? Is it reading a whole bunch of, white papers of how things are done? Please don't tell me it's that one.
No, not at all. I actually, a simpler start, because I think I like building block type things. Like, you start simple and then you can dive in wherever you want in any given rabbit hole per se. But my recommendation is, so we have what we call the acquisition and execution time zones. And this is a Skyway kind of model, if you will. But what we've designed is that we've broken down the phases that happen prior to contract award. And then we've broken down the phases that happen exactly after contract award. And so that map is, if you understand what's going on and when, then you can plan more appropriately. So like I like to share with clients, like you don't have the same concerns, the same problems, or the same issues after you win a contract that you do 2 months into your bidding on a contract. Like there's 2 months due for the proposal to be due.
Right.
You have totally different concerns. And so depending on where you are in the acquisition or the execution time zones will depend on how you respond to the government's process. And once you know where you are, you can say, oh, I know this. I do pre-award all the time. I know where we are. I'm good. But if it's a part of the map you're not aware of, you're like, I don't. Now you know, let me go research that because this is where I'm at. And so I think that would be helpful, a place to start as far as process.
Perfect. It's important not to be caught unaware.
Absolutely.
Because nobody wants to be putting proposals in over holiday weekends.
Yeah.
They tend to happen that way, but we try to avoid that.
The government does it.
Right.
The government tends to, the mindset that they have, and I used to have the same mindset, but now that I'm on the other side, I now understand how it was not a good decision. Is that in their mind, they're thinking, I have the holiday. They're thinking that's time that the vendors that we all have to respond. Right. And it's like, so they're building that into the response, and they're using the holiday to cut down on time instead of adding on more time, where it's like, well, we're human too. Like, I want to celebrate the holiday. I don't want to be writing proposals on the holiday, you know, and that's what ends up happening. It's like, it's due the day after Memorial Day or something. Like, it's crazy. It's like,
well, it's good to have that little tidbit of information in there. So awesome. Well, that kind of takes us through. If anybody has questions that didn't get answered or that come up after, we've kind of chatted, you are welcome to email either myself or Troy, or if you have ATI specific questions, you can email that ATI@govmates.com address. We do, for those on the line, have an OTA 101, an OTA in the consortium model webinar coming up on May 31st, which is a couple days after Memorial Day. And there's really nothing you need to do to prepare, just attend if you would like. But that again is presented by GovMates and ATI as well. So if you need the link to that, we would be happy to get that for you so that you can register. We'll be talking to some of the individuals who are really well versed in the OTA space and about how we can make use of those things. So Troy, anything else that you wanted to add before we kind of wrap up for the day?
No, I think we've covered it all. This was great. I was really happy to present today, and hopefully the folks on the line, hopefully you gained a nugget or two out of this that'll help you in the future with your government contracting efforts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everybody who joined us, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Meg.